So this is the presentation I wish I had back in 2009 when I first started using GitHub. I was in university. I didn't really know version control, but my friends started telling me about GitHub and these founders and the Ruby community and all these people who could just help you out work on your programs or your applications that you're building. And it was a great place to go find projects to work on. And if you're new to using GitHub, show of hands if you are new. If you used it, you signed up this year, and this is your first kind of year of using GitHub. Great. How many people have used it over 3 years? Right. Same kind of a number of people who've been to OSCON, a number of years, which is good. So if you're a new user, welcome. Let us know. I always accept feature requests verbally, although no promises ever made. Sometimes I go out to dinner, I go to OSCON, people are like, you work at GitHub, cool. So have you thought about this? And we're like, yes, you and a million other people have told me about that, and we're actively working on it, or whatever it may be, or actively thinking about it. And if you've been here a while, I welcome you to think outside the box. So what I want to show today are going to be some things that maybe you've seen before, but haven't really thought about it for your current workflow. If you work at a company, maybe think about some of these things that you can take back to them and say, I saw this at a talk, we should do this immediately. This is a really quick thing that we can do, a little lever that we can pull to immediately get some extra gain out of our workflow, or something additional that allows us to use the product a little bit more interestingly, different. The more different things you have, speaking to even just diversity itself in your workflow, it's going to allow your brain to work in different ways. So keep that in mind. Obviously, back in 2009, when I was first starting using GitHub, some of these features didn't exist, but some of them actually did very shortly after 2009. And we'll talk about some of those. We'll show some of those. And this is going to be roughly in chronological order. Some of these are a lot older. Some of them are newer, especially my last slide is one of the newest things. And I just want to paint that picture for you, especially as you see how early in the slide some of these things might be. They've probably been around for quite a while. So I don't want to just list off features. Sometimes people, they come to a talk like this and they're like, oh great, I only want to hear some features that I may not know about. And that's fine too, but like I said, think about some of these with respect to what can I do tomorrow? What can I do right after this session? Is there something you can take away from this and not have to go write a retrospective back to your company, your boss, whatever it is, talking about the advantages of going to OSCON, but what can you do immediately when you leave this room? That's what I want you all to be thinking about as you're going through this. What are some things that I can work on or you can work on immediately to start getting some return on this? So I've been at GitHub for a little over 2.5 years. I did some contracting before that. I was previously on the training team. Now when I start telling people I'm a sales engineer, they say, sales is in your name, you're just trying to sell me on something. I'm basically doing the exact same thing I've always been doing at GitHub. I just want people who are using the product or interested in the product to know what it has and know how it can help them, and I just want you to ship code faster. So some of these things allow you to do that and onboard your team a little bit faster. And also, first tip of the day, when trying to find a good image for me to use, of course I use my GitHub profile picture. If you go to github.com/yourusername.png, it redirects you to the actual profile picture for you to grab. So first tip of the day, if you need to grab a good profile picture, easily just add .png to the end of your profile URL. So let's get into it, right? We've been talking, especially at OSCON, and it felt really, really good yesterday that we need to do open source. And the talk yesterday, I can't remember what it was talking about, what the title was at the keynote, but talking about the speed of open source and talking about the sound barrier and being ahead of the game. And so that's a good reason for using open source. You want to contribute to open source to stay faster, to stay more relevant with new technologies that are coming out. But these types of workflows using open source and getting used to that is new for a lot of companies. So there's a couple quick reasons we'd want to use this. We kind of have, if we're a company that's using an open source project, and if we put people on that project to work on it, you are starting to control, or at least have a vested interest in your own destiny. So there's no way that we at GitHub can ever say, well, we can't do that because of a limitation in Git. We employ 2 members on the core Git team. So anything that we actually want, we can start talking to the community more directly with. Or when we built Rescue, which is a Ruby backend delayed jobs system, we could say, well, this is the way we use it. How are other people using it? We want the open source community to contribute with us, but they can say, this is the way we use it. Here's some efficiencies we have, and we need to fix some things. And I've seen this down the road with Redis, which is what Rescue is built on, had some efficiency problems with it, and someone sent a pull request even a couple months ago to fix that, and it's an active project as well. As an individual contributor, you can show that you're going above and beyond the call of duty. So you have your day job, and that's very difficult. You come home at 5 o'clock or 6 or 7 or 8, whatever it may be, and you may be a little burned out. But if you do start pushing the bounds on your own limitation and your own skills, you can become a better developer. Whether you work in Python at work or .NET, and then you want to practice with Go or Haskell or whatever it may be, you're going to expand your brain's capacity to actually solve problems. So working with open source, when you have 20 million repositories to look at, is a pretty powerful thing. And then lastly, you don't need to hire people to continuously work on just one project. Once it's open source, once you've open sourced a project, now you have a task force of a bunch of other people to help you with that project. And in fact, you also kind of have a candidate pool to pull from as well. So that's an interesting thought to think about. So let's get into this kind of first feature here. How many people knew that GitHub was the largest subversion hosting on the planet? A few people. This is accurate. I want to thank our co-founder, Scott Chacon, for releasing this feature on April 1st, or April Fool's Day. Maybe a week later, a couple days later, I know it's a little blurry of a screenshot here, and there is a demo. I'm not actually going to be relying on Wi-Fi for any of my work today because that would be terrible. It actually works, he says at the bottom of this blog post. And then there's another blog post or another update from us talking more about this. And as a trainer and as a teacher, we often have people who say, well, we're moving over from Subversion. We need to migrate all of our things, and it's really hard to convince people. And I say, well, you can just say SVN checkout and then the URL, and it brings it down to their laptop and they can work on it. Or SVN check-in, and that'll work as well. It's their actual Git repository, or their actual SVN repositories. So let's take a look at this. So just SVN checkout, and then a project that I had forked on my end. And as I CD into that project, we can see here on the bottom of the screen, I have a .svn folder. I have my branches folder. I actually don't know too many workflows with SVN, but I have my trunk folder, my branches, my SVN. I have all the history of that entire project on my machine. So if we're coming over from SVN and we have some people working with us who don't necessarily want to use Git right away, they can use SVN. That's a step in the right direction. Past that, you maybe want to use the Git SVN bridge, which allows people to kind of use a mix of the commands to interact with GitHub, and then eventually maybe with some training or teaching online materials, they can start using Git itself and not just SVN. All right, so the next thing is a URL shortener. Git.io is actually a thing that we have to do a URL shortener. So if it's a GitHub URL and you wanted to share that URL, and I think the URL structure is pretty good. It's github.com/a-user or organization/a project name. But depending on capitals and language barriers, it's sometimes easier just to give someone a short URL, git.io/ and about 7 digits. So if you use Ruby, you can actually install this onto your command line right away by saying gem install git.io and start shrinking your URLs immediately. Make sure that's actually running. Git.io shrink, and then that project, it gives me that little URL. I could have piped that onto PB copy so it was on my keyboard. Open that up, and it directs me right to my repository. So if you're sharing stuff internally at a very large organization or a very large open source project, you want to pass these things around, sometimes that URL is a little bit better, especially if you were going to tweet it maybe, you have character constrictions, that kind of stuff. .patch at the end of a pull request. So a lot of people have different workflows when working with pull request. But if you go over to a pull request and you add .patch to the end of that, what that does is the same git command under the covers as git format -patch, and you give it a range of commits. So what format dash patch is originally for is formulating a number of patches to make your feature that are useful to put into mail, because that's how Git core actually works. You have to send stuff into the mailing list, they see the patches, and then one of the core contributors grabs them and puts them into Git core for you. So .patch, if you still wanted to work with pull requests but wanted to contribute to a project like Git core who didn't accept pull request, you could formulate your patches that way. Maybe you have a bot or some automated system that goes out to the URL to actually grab that. One side note about curling the URL for your pull request, you are going to have to use the -L to follow the redirect, because we redirect that off to another front-end server. It's format, I can't actually read the slide, but it's patchdiff.githubusercontent.com, etc. So patches, if you have a specific workflow and you want to work with patches but not really have to do them in the pull request, you can work with them this way. This is one of my favorite sections, because as I teach people and we teach them about pull request and workflows, they often think, well, I'm working with open source, I need to go out to that project. I can't push to that project, so I need to fork it. If you're unfamiliar with forking, the analogy I use in class is it's like going to the library, finding a book, but you want your own copy of the book to live at the library. You take that book, you go over to the photocopier, you copy every single page out of it, you rebind it, and you put it back on the shelf. That's like GitHub as the library. It's hosting that book for you. And you want your own specific copy of that book that you can edit. So that's what your fork is here. But when you start forking repositories, you don't always have to just send the pull request back to the original maintainer. You can send them to a coworker. Maybe you and she can start working on this feature. And then when you're all done with it, then you send it back to the upstream repository. Or you just want to send it to yourself. That's also something people forget, is even though I'm working on a fork, I can send this pull request right back to myself, because all pull requests care about are branches with two different series of commits. So as long as the commit hashes are different, a pull request is open and available to work on. So let's take a look about this quickly here. I'll have to apologize for a little bit of the rendering here, but what I'm doing is out on that training utils project, I'm creating a new branch so I can do this feature work. And the welcome message here on this small script is not necessarily very friendly. It just says enter instructor name. It's kind of robotic to me. So I say, well, why don't we just make it what is the instructor name? So ask for a little bit more info, write a proper commit message here, and commit our changes to our branch. Now when I go back, it asks me to send a pull request. And by default, a fork is going to send the pull request back to that parent repository. In this case, the GitHub training user on GitHub. But as you saw there, I can change those dropdowns to change the base repository that I'm sending it to. I can change the branches. If I wanted to send this to my coworker, Joshua Wayner, I could send it to him because he's also forked this repository. This is what we call the repository network. And you can view this if you click the number next to the fork icon in the upper right-hand corner. Now, if you go to a big project like Bootstrap, which has over 38,000 forks, it's not going to generate a repository list for you, or a repository network list for you, because it's way too much. So I was able to send myself a pull request here. I actually confused a couple coworkers with this recently, so which is, say what you will about that. For the longest time, GitHub has been able to close issues and pull requests from the command line. So more specifically in the commit message. So when you're in the commit message, if maybe your workflow doesn't involve clicking the merge button from a pull request, but it involves you merging manually and pushing up to master. Now that'll if the commits are the same, that'll close out the pull request because it'll see that, yes, you close this pull request from a given commit. But what about when you use issues for task lists, which I'll be showing here in just a bit, or you use issues for some lightweight project management? When you close your pull request, or when you're merging your pull request, I should say, you want to make sure that your issue is closed as well. You don't want to do any extra work, and if you start typing the pound symbol or the hashtag and then some numbers or some titles, you'll see the list of other issues and pull requests in there. So you want to kind of close out this full software development lifecycle process. So we have an issue here. So this is issue number 2. And this just says the welcome script needs to be a little bit friendlier. We know we have a pull request open for this. We just sent it to ourselves. So to kind of close both these things out at once, not only the feature work, but the issue as well, when we're typing in that merge box, we can autocomplete just like we would in any comment box on GitHub. So that's fine. I merged that in, delete my branch, cognitive clutter, as some people call that. And then I go over to my issue, and we see it's already closed. In fact, it says it was closed by a given commit. That's that merge commit from that pull request. So I don't have to go into this work. I don't have to go into the issue. I know it's automatically closed because I'm using a specific keyword when I merge that. I say closes, closed, close, singular, fixed, fixed, fixes to merge those pull requests, or close those issues from a pull request. And also we see it in the commit message as well. How many people use gist on a given day? Real quick way to do a to-do list. As I do 1, 3, and 6 month goals for me just at work or in open source. I usually maintain those in a single gist, a private gist as it is. Or maybe you have a to-do list of what you're going to do that day. Put that in a gist as well. That's all really great. But what else can you do with gist? Well, they appear Git backed. You see on the tab on the right-hand side that there's a revision number, which is kind of different for Git versus Subversion, which has revision numbers. But they're full Git projects. They have branches. You're not going to see them in the UI. They don't have pull requests. They don't have issues. But they do have branches. And they have multi-files as well. A lot of I don't actually use the multi-file too often, but there are multiple files. So let's take a look at what this is. So I have a project up on a gist right now called Generate Random Changes. So as I'm going through classes, I need to say, all right, I need to make 5 commits with a Ruby files called master-testing, whatever it is, just to generate some commits to practice. So I can grab that URL, and then over in my terminal, clone that down, name it something rememberable, because you don't want to just have a gist URL as your folder name. Change into that, and I can just immediately start making some changes. So here I'm actually just going to make a commit on the command line, add a README to this, and then push that up to the server as well. And so any gist itself, if you're involved in Ruby or any other libraries that you're making, or any other programming languages that have good libraries like Ruby does in its gems, you can actually point a gem or a library to a gist because it is a full Git repository, which gems can actually use. So I made my commit. I said add commit. I'm always going to try to teach people how to commit and write commit messages properly, regardless of how far away from training I get. And then we can see up at the top, there's an actual markdown file, just like we would expect on github.com, to be rendered out for us. So very useful. Blame. Blame is such a cool Git command. Although it sounds like it has a negative connotation, and maybe Linus originally intended for it to be a negative command, you are looking at a file and saying, who changed this line most recently? So you say git blame and then a file name, and it'll list out the contents of that file. And each line along the way, it'll say the most recent person who edited that line. You can have it follow to find out the history, if there's renames, all that stuff. That's great. But I don't always want to type that on the command line. It's a little hard to find those. You find the commit, and then you say git show that commit, and maybe follow the rabbit hole that way. I like doing this in the web. So any project like the backup utils project that we have here for backing up your enterprise instance, you can go into the project here, find a file like GHE backup, and say blame. This is one of our longer projects that we've had for GitHub Enterprise the last couple of months. You can see commits from 2014, July, August. We see one from January 7th, but there's also one here about enable maintenance mode. So let's go ahead and click that commit. And we can actually see not only when that line was last edited, but on that screen, we saw that it was that commit was brought in from a pull request number 9, which of course, just like every other pull request, has a conversation view, the file's changed. You can see the discussion around how that commit even made it in, and what other changes came in with that commit, maybe not just in GHE backup. A lot of times when developers at GitHub need to find the reason why certain changes were made to our core, they'll do this exact same workflow. They don't do it on the command line. They do it git blame in the files itself. So just like any other pull request, we can see these changes. How many people went to Ben Balter's talk yesterday? He was talking about the number of licenses on open source projects on GitHub, and it was upsettingly low. Anyone see the keynote yesterday talking about licenses, or the Ignite talk, rather, talking about licenses? There's a large number of people who don't have licenses on their projects. And a lot of people, myself included, I'm very guilty of this. Don't go to my projects and yell at me for this. If you do see me without licenses, send me a pull request. You get an extra little star in a contribution graph. A project on GitHub is not actually open source, truly, until it has a license. Yes, it's there. Yes, you can view it. But there is no legal mention of how you can use that project. If you include a project in your open source work at work that doesn't have a license, you should immediately go send them a pull request for any license. And we have a few of them that you can choose from. So here we have an example of my friend Brent Jackson, not Brent Beer, Brent Jackson. He has his website, jacksonblack.github.io. It's a Pages site. It's just his website, but it doesn't have a license. So I create a branch. I go to add a new file, and here's the important part. Adding a new file in the web view makes adding a license easy. I type the word license, and it pops open a template for me. If I want MIT, or maybe I don't know the name of the license, I can start typing it. There's MIT. And it drops it in for me. It's not really mine, so I want to say Brent Jackson, not Brent Beer. Scroll down to the bottom, do a proper commit message, and send him a pull request. I'm not sure if GPL3 is there. We default to some in the very beginning as the most suggested. These are all pulled from a project called choosealicense.org. I know we have GPL2. I'm not sure off the top of my head if we have GPL3, but there's discussion, I'm sure, around GPL3 and other popular licenses. Also, sorry, it's at the bottom of the screen. When you go to a pull request and you're sending a pull request to someone, if you're unfamiliar or you're a little worried about one particular change, you can comment on that specific line of that pull request, not on the conversation tab. You can go to the particular line and say, hey, I think this change is maybe what I wanted to add. Let me know if this isn't what you were thinking. Or, does he want his GitHub username here as a copyright instead of his actual first and last name? I'm not sure. And these line level comments are brought back into the conversation view too. So they're not lost anywhere. All conversation on a pull request or on a commit that's involved in a pull request is always brought back to that conversation tab. So a lot of times making mistakes is pretty easy with coding. I don't want to say with Git, but with coding in general. And sometimes you submit a change, you have pull requests, you have code review, you have people who've said it looked good, they've commented, they're responsible with you. And then it goes into production and suddenly some errors start escalating. It's not terrible, it's not the end of the world, but you know what? Let's go ahead and undo that pull request. Or maybe I accidentally merged it without any review. So I want to pull that code out before someone can actually review it and comment on it appropriately. So the example that I did earlier, whereas I submitted a pull request to myself, I had no one give me a review on it. I just said, yep, this is great. It's a better welcome message. Let me just merge this change. So I can go back into that merged pull request that I had earlier, and there's actually a button for this called revert, shockingly. And what that'll do is it'll open a whole new pull request for you, doing the exact same thing the revert operation on the command line would do. The only difference here is that when you open a pull request for something, you have a URL. As Matthew mentioned at the keynotes yesterday, we have a coworker, Matthew McCullough mentioned at the keynotes. We have a coworker, Ben Balter, who also did the license talk yesterday. If you like it, put a URL on it. Don't put a ring on it, put a URL on it. And URLs are forever. That's the other thing that's really important to think about here. As we have these projects that we're working on, and we have these pull requests, remember that those pull requests are URLs that you can always go to. Some new person can come to later. They can see the motivation behind that pull request. Why did this happen? We actually saw this when I looked at backup utils with that blame command, or that blame view. I can see the full conversation to the changes they made on this. So as you're reverting your pull request, or you say, well, I don't want people to think that I made a mistake, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with making mistakes? Be proud of your mistakes and show the new people the way that they should properly accept their own mistakes. Because when we have mistakes, we learn from it. So as this URL is here, we actually saw at the top of the screen, the branch name is automatically created for us. So it's a nice kind of automation there as well. Tracking issues are really cool. So some people always, people talk to me and they say, when's GitHub going to have more project management features? When's GitHub going to add something that does more control over my repository and the features I'm working on? Well, we have a thing called task list, rather, and we often put those in tracking issues. So within the training team specifically, we'll open an issue for every event that we're going to go to. And to make sure everything's lined up and ready for that in-person event, we'll have a bunch of task lists, which are just written in Markdown. So it's a dash and then 2 square brackets of all the things that we actually need to do. So it's kind of our go, no-go flight check. So inside of a given issue, if I was going to open it up, I'd maybe say it's going to be a tracking issue and write some things in there and mention the motivation behind this. And I went ahead and sped this up a little bit so we didn't have to just sit here and pretend I'm typing and doing all this work. The important part is that you put this task list in the opening post or the original post of an issue. So we see that syntax. It's a dash, 2 square brackets separated by a space, and then some text describing what the to-do item is. So I go ahead and I open this. And if you want to mark one as closed right away, you can just put an X instead of a space there. But for me, I like clicking check boxes. So immediately I check that. And we see that because it's in the opening post, back on just the raw list of all of our issues or pull requests, it works the same way there. We can see how many items are maybe left to be worked on within this project. So if you have a big project and you wanted to break it up and break it into sub-tasks or sub-issues or additional features, and you wanted to have someone later come back to this and say, how did you make that new feature? In fact, if you've seen our blog post recently talking about Direct Org Membership, which is an early access program, there was many task list items talking about the way we were doing this. We'd send out user research studies for people to do them, and we'd track all of those in issues and in pull requests to see how complete a feature actually is. We use this every single day. Is tracking a keyword there? No. I simply added tracking to the top of that because as I scroll through a list, it's easy for me to see. And also when email comes through to my Gmail, I could set up a custom filter for that. So in the title, there's no magic there. Also, I've seen people create labels. Labels is a really good one just because it's color and it actually stands out. You could say green is a tracking issue, orange is maybe to-do items left, or red is needs review, stuff like that. Also, if anyone else does have any questions, there will be time afterwards, but if you have quick questions, by all means, please ask them. I will cut you off and tell you to hold on to it or write it down if it ends up getting too long. Rendering non-code files on GitHub is awesome. I love bringing as many people into my project as possible. And this is important too when you're trying to get GitHub adopted at your company, or if you're just new starting out with GitHub and you want to get an exposure into what this is. If you're giving a talk on design and you're trying to get more designers using GitHub, which there actually is a concurrent talk right now from another attendee giving a talk about having more designers use GitHub. This is a really good way to start. Have them drop images into GitHub for Mac or GitHub for Windows and upload those to GitHub. If you have large files, we have Git LFS now, so you can kind of store those off to the side. Still view them still view things like images, GeoJSON files. If you're not familiar with GeoJSON, it's essentially a map of coordinate points, and we render that using a product called Mapbox in the web, so you can actually see that. But also the images are diffable. You have one version of the image and another. How do they change? You can view that diff on GitHub. You can view the diff of a map on GitHub. You can view a 3D file like this one on GitHub. So as you're doing 3D printing, like so many people are kind of experimenting with and practicing with, you can actually see these .stl files and how they'd look before you print them. If you're submitting pull requests to someone, they could say, well, you've edited my 3D file, but I don't know what you've changed. You can view the diff of the files as well. Say again? No video. Sorry, very large. Yeah. So this, before I start the demo here, this is a gear. This is a 3D printer project from some user. He received a pull request, STL's small gear. I don't know the project or the type of project he's working on here, but there was a gear and it needed to be changed. The way that some of the rendering of it maybe was wrong, and they needed to rotate some of the actual teeth on it a little bit, whatever it may be. So let's take a look at this. So you can see it just renders the raw file here. You have two different types of revisions on the bottom, the highlighting or the revision slider. So I can say oldest on that side, newest to this side. You can zoom in, change your perspective, see how that's actually changing a little bit better there, and then maybe switch back over to highlight and say, okay, they've kind of rotated the teeth here, and we saw that the part in the middle changed. But also PDFs, that's what this is. And this is just a PDF being rendered out on GitHub. Now, as you have projects, maybe you're collaborating with non-code contributors, and they have some code that they're working on, or some project that they're working on. This one's actually from NASA, talking about 3D printing and some of the stuff that they do there, or 3D models that they do there. In this case, it's a 2D model. That they dropped their PDF into their project. So anyone browsing the code, looking at the 3D models, and coming over to the PDF can actually click into that, and we will render it for you. So you don't have to download that PDF to actually view it. You can render it and view it right in GitHub as well. So those of you who are new, using GitHub in the last year, are you all subscribed to the newsletter? Some no's, some yeses. There's a newsletter that you can get on a daily, weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly scale based on the types of projects that are trending, things that have been started and followed by GitHub staff, and things that have been started and followed by you and your friends. So you get an update about this in an email at a frequency, multiple frequencies as you so choose to. I believe it's day, we'll see here in a minute, but day, week, and month. Now, some people may say, well, we don't use GitHub.com, but we use GitHub Enterprise. How's this useful? Well, as you have a multi-thousand person company using GitHub Enterprise, do you know everything everyone's working on? Probably not. But receiving an email notification about some popular projects that your coworkers are seeing other coworkers work on is just like creating your own tiny GitHub within your company. So this newsletter and the Explore feature is very, very nice. So our Explore feature defaults to some showcases that we've selected. But as you're on just this page, you can scroll down and see essentially what this page will contain. Trending repositories this week, starred by people you follow this week, and then at the very bottom, there's a learn more for the newsletter, which if you're interested is just explore/subscribe. So there's an example of what that would look like on a given day, to see what kind of projects you'd receive notifications about. I receive one every day, and I'm actively trying to find more and more people on GitHub to follow, because the more people you follow that are interesting, doing cool things, and that are interested in other projects, the better your newsletter, your daily hub, maybe you could call it, is going to be, to find out what's happening around GitHub or what's happening within your organization. So it's a great way to stay in tune and in touch with the type of work that's being done around you and finding out about projects that you maybe didn't know about, maybe before someone posted to Hacker News or Reddit or whatever it is. This is a kind of a newer feature. The URL existed for this for a while, but we've changed this up to be a lot more predominant. In the top of every GitHub page now, there's two links that are there that weren't previously not there. It just says pull request and issues. You can always click those because they're at the top of the bar. Now on GitHub, if anything's at the top of the window in that header, that means it's global. If you click on your notifications, when you're inside of a repository and you're looking at that repository, you click on your web notifications, that's going to take you to the web notifications about that project. If you're just on the dashboard or you're viewing your profile, someone else's profile, or you just opened up a random page and you said, oh man, I know I have a bunch of work to do that's maybe outstanding that I need to work on, you can go to github.com/pulls or issues, And that'll be your global list of all pull requests and issues by default that you've created. Now, as we'll see here, I'm signed in as the GitHub student. There's created, assigned, and involves, or mentions, as buttons in that upper left-hand corner. Now, before I start the video, created is obviously pull requests or issues that I've created. And mentioned is ones where someone has brought me into the conversation. So maybe those are ones that I missed the email notification or web notification about, but I'm involved in some way, and someone has tried to bring me into the conversation to get me to actually do the work, and I forgot. So it's always good to kind of use this as your to-do list. As you're working on multiple projects within multiple open source organizations, you can come here and actually change the organization dropdown to narrow it down to those different organizations. So raw list of stuff the GitHub student hasn't done in too long. So I can say, well, let's go over to the GitHub school specific organization and only things that I'm mentioned on but not created. Right, so there's a more cleanup that the GitHub I opened, but then the GitHub teacher commented back to me. So a good way to find some of those issues or pull requests that you maybe have forgotten about. So that's one of the newer features. And kind of last but certainly not least, there's a couple things that I had actually cut out of this. So many things to continuously talk about is Atom. Even at our booth in the expo hall, people say, oh, did GitHub create Atom? We did. It's one of the longest projects we've ever had at GitHub. Our founder, Chris Wanstrother, defunct, started working on Atom about 6 or 7 years ago. And it's gone through many iterations since, only being released last year. But we think it's at a really good point, and that's why we released it. And we open sourced it completely. So you can go to github.com/atom/atom to start contributing to it directly. And Atom also has a very, very large ecosystem of other projects and packages. So if you say, well, I don't use Atom because I'm using Sublime. Well, why are you using Sublime? Is there something in Atom that maybe you could contribute to contribute back to open source to make the project better? The code that actually runs Atom, or the platform that Atom is actually built on, we've changed the name of, and it's always been open source, called Electron. Electron.atom.io is, I think, one of the coolest things that we've ever worked on. What Electron does is allow you to build desktop clients for any operating system using the same technology you'd use to write a web page. Think about that for a minute. I don't have to know how C# works. I don't have to know how to write .NET. I just write in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, some JSON, work through those projects, and then I'll have a desktop client for any user to use. That's, in fact, Linux, Windows, Mac, and ARM processors. So if you have a Chromebook, you could make a desktop client for it as well. So Atom's pretty cool. I like Atom because of that, but it's also just a fun text editor. So let's take a look at a little bit of Atom itself. So I had that generate random changes project, and I want to do some additional work on it. Now, one thing I'm going to preface all of us with is merge conflicts. I'm going to work on a merge conflict here, and we're going to see how Atom makes that trivial for me now. How many people hate merge conflicts in Git? There's a number of you not raising your hands, and I know you don't like them. Yeah. How many people solve them manually? Going into the file, just removing the merge markers. And how many people use an external client to do this, whether the one that ships with Mac or Windows or anything like that? So a number of them, some of them are paid. I've used a couple, but none of them have been as good as the one I'm about to show you, especially because it was free and I could hack on it anytime I wanted to. So in that gist, I'm working on the Git repository locally, I'm going to create a branch here to just update the README and the script comment in the script file. Because what I'm going to do is, as I've done in classes, is generate a merge conflict. So we have this line here, line number 3. I'm going to change it to say something different, but I'm essentially saying the same thing. And in the README, let's change the top line as well. So I'm doing this as feature work. Now, this is going to be the exact same as if you and a colleague were trying to race to get something into production, and they beat you to it, and then when you merged, you pulled down, you generated a conflict. That's essentially what I'm simulating here. So on that feature branch, I'm committing. For demo purposes, I'm mentioning this was done on a feature branch. And now let's switch back to master and do essentially the same amount of work, kind of simulating this merge conflict. So instead of number of arguments, I say quantity of arguments. And I edited the README to say OSCON US. So let's go ahead and add and commit those. And then the next step I'll do is actually just merge this from the command line. So this is kind of synonymous with you're working on a feature branch with someone and you pull the change down. If you're curious about all this, I can, of course, share steps to do this and recreate this if you want to practice afterwards. So I generated the merge conflict. Now here's the way it normally looks. You have those merge markers, what's in head, and what was pulled in. But then we have this package, which, of course, needs updated. That's going to highlight this for us, because all this is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so it's putting CSS wrappers around the conflicts, removing the merge markers for us. And I can say, OK, you know what? I've edited that, and it looks good. Let me see. Sorry, it's in the lower right-hand corner. Adam will, and we'll see it in a minute, too, when I show the maintainers demo. There's a list of all files that have conflicts currently. So I picked one of the choices there instead of editing. Now we can see both of those. Get diff-stage, not get diff, because it's in the staging area. So we can see the changes that are about to be merged in. And when we have a conflict, we don't want to just do git commit-m and write something. We actually, as status will show us, just say git commit, which will open up our default text editor, which for me is Adam. So the default message looks good, save and quit. And when we're all done with that, we can say git status again and see that we're ahead by 3 commits. Now that package itself doesn't come by default on Atom, but it's free. It's on GitHub for you to look at. In fact, when you install the package, you can click in and read about it yourself. There's custom key bindings for this package to allow you to detect conflicts, select a certain conflict as you want to. And then there's the README, because this is what's hosted on GitHub, to show this work as well. So animated GIFs, a huge fan of as well. So there's a number of features, how to contribute to it. If there's a package you don't like, you could fork it, make your own package, bring that in for your company, and work on it that way. That's the part that I love about Atom. There's a million, well, not a million, literally billion, but there's hundreds of packages out there for us to contribute and work on that we can add to our own workflows and our own text editors. If you know everyone is doing things in a certain way, you can actually make the workflow for them a little bit easier by writing your own Atom package and making it easier for them. Amazing work. So I hope you enjoyed the even slightly extended version of the talk, because we started early. But I hope the thing that we take away from this is not, OK, that was great. I'll go work on that maybe next week when I get done with the conference. I have all these emails I got to get back to, and I have so much work that's piling up. But I don't want you to think, what am I going to do in a week? Or what am I going to do tomorrow because I'm busy today? I want you to think, what am I going to do today? Or what am I going to do immediately walking out of this room? Because you have a 10-minute break, and you should all do this. Open up your laptops. I don't care if you have to wait in here. Send a pull request to yourself. Create that license file. Get to work on that. And start making changes to your workflows and the ways you use the product today. Thank you.